Hi, I'm Jan Hawke and I'm here to present. This is all about writers who self-publish. Now we may think that self-publishing is a relatively new thing in this digital age, but in fact self-publishing in a commercial sense has been with us for a long time. From the time that Johannes Gutenberg went into business in around 1439 with his newfangled flatbed press using movable metal type, you either had to be wealthy or know someone who was really rich to get published. Today it's very different, of course, but it wasn't so very long ago that compositors were still using lead-based hot metal, as seen here on the left, for the mass production of newspapers and books. In the Orient, movable type had been around 400 years longer, although primarily used for decorating porcelain. This was because the huge size of the Chinese alphabet meant that only the imperial dynasties could bear the time taken and the costs involved in publication of text. It was most definitely a case of who you knew if a writer wanted their work published. Back in Europe, with paper manufacture becoming increasingly mechanised and with the Renaissance inspiring the aristocracy to become literate or wanting to surround themselves with the appearance of being so, the print industry was riding high. Suddenly, with books and pamphlets being produced in huge numbers and made available to lay people as well as to the clergy, even the less well-off parts of society were wanting to read or to have access to more visual forms of storytelling through plays and musical entertainments. By the late 1500s, in England, a young playwright by the name of Will Shakespeare was going down a storm with theatre-goers in Elizabethan London. William Shakespeare. It is not in the stars to hold our destiny, but in ourselves. Shakespeare left a modest sum of money in his will for his theatrical friends to have memorial medals made. Instead, they decided to put the money towards publishing the very first edition of the complete works of William Shakespeare. Of course, the printing industry followed old world explorers and settlers to the Americas. Publishing played a vital part in ushering in a new age of independence. Benjamin Franklin. Without continual growth and progress, such words as improvement, achievement, and success have no meaning. It is no surprise that Franklin was known as the first American. His background as owner, editor, and printer of the Pennsylvania Gazette helped make him a superlative politician. Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. So said John Adams of another of the founding fathers, Thomas Paine. I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavouring to make our fellow creatures happy. What more needs to be said about one of the greatest ever champions for human rights? A friend and admirer of Paine, our next self-publisher had little support from any quarter. Only after his death was he hailed as a misunderstood genius. William Blake. Imagination is the real and eternal world of which this vegetable universe is but a faint shadow. In many ways, Blake was a visionary ahead of his time. A devout Christian, he was critical of organised religion and outraged the establishment with his liberal views on sexual orientation and by declaring that marriage was a form of slavery. His poetry and artwork were ridiculed throughout his lifetime, but he nevertheless is now seen as a leading light of the Romantic age. In an age when genteel women were often invisible unless they married well, there was one who managed to pull off being her own independent woman, while keeping her sense of humour and propriety, and remaining a perfect and highly literate lady. Jane Austen. The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid. And to paraphrase, the person who cannot find a wry smile or full-on belly laugh reading Miss Austen's peerless satire must be completely humourless. In her lifetime, her work was only ever attributed to a lady, and published with the help of her brother Henry through Thomas Egerton's printing house. The grandson of an Afro-Caribbean slave, his pen name was his grandmother's surname, not his French grandfather's, Dumas has much in common with modern independent writers in that he established and funded his own indie publishing house. Alexandre Dumas. Happiness is like those palaces in fairy tales whose gates are guarded by dragons. We must fight in order to conquer it. One of his friends and admirers declared that Dumas was the most generous, large-hearted being in the world. He was also the most delightfully amusing and egotistical creature on the face of the earth. Generally thought to be the first well-known American writer to attempt to earn his living solely by writing, Edgar Allan Poe. They who dream by day are cognizant of many things which escape those who dream only by night. Much has been said about Poe's life that would today be legally actionable, especially false rumours about drug addiction. Certainly, he never became rich from his work, although he did achieve fame in his lifetime for his innovative poetry and unique prose style. Today, he is credited as being the first author to write detective fiction and one of the first to tackle science fiction. By any period's standards, Dickens was a best-selling literary success story. Charles Dickens. Have a heart that never hardens, and a temper that never tires, and a touch that never hurts. Given his poor start in life, after his father's imprisonment for debt ended Charles' school days, becoming rich and successful himself was always a major goal for Dickens. After landing a job as a political journalist, Dickens never looked back and became the pioneer king of serialized storytelling. Philosopher, abolitionist, poet, essayist, naturalist, surveyor, historian, and political radical whom some regarded as an anarchist. Henry David Thoreau. Pursue some path, however narrow and crooked, in which you can walk with love and reverence. Thoreau was one of the most original and influential writers of his generation, inspiring the likes of Leo Tolstoy, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr., who all admired his stance in his seminal essay, Civil Disobedience. Another poet, journalist, and essayist, Whitman is often named as the father of free verse in America. Walt Whitman. I have learned that to be with those I like is enough. Walt was interested in the philosophy of transcendentalism and realism, and his work incorporates both those influences. Often seen as controversial, His free-form poetry collection, the much revised Leaves of Grass, was considered obscene by many, so Whitman decided to publish it independently. Primarily the most celebrated art critic in Victorian England, Ruskin was also a skilled essayist, poet, watercolourist and philanthropist. John Ruskin. Quality is never an accident, it is always the result of intelligent effort. Ruskin started young. His first publication, at the tender age of 10, was the poem On Skiddaw and Derwentwater. This was a nature study written after visiting the Lake District, sparking a lifetime fascination with geology and environmental issues. Classically educated, Emily Dickinson never married and was considered reclusive and eccentric by her neighbours, rarely leaving her rooms. Emily Dickinson. The soul should always stand ajar, ready to welcome the ecstatic experience. Inspired by Wordsworth, Shakespeare, Longfellow and Charlotte Bronte, Emily's passion was for poetry. Only a dozen pieces were published in her lifetime, heavily edited. Her sister and friends had her full catalogue published after her death. Samuel Langhorne Clemens is often said to have written the great American novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He was much better known by his pen name, Mark Twain. There are basically two types of people: people who accomplish things and people who claim to have accomplished things. The first group is less crowded. Twain was certainly in that first group, and nobody can deny his genius for bringing his worlds to vivid life. Author of Robert's Rules of Order, our next self-publisher was driven to write that work after disastrously failing to lead an abolitionist church meeting. Henry M. Robert. Where there is no law, but every man does what is right in his own eyes, there is the least of real liberty. Loosely based on parliamentary procedures in the US House of Representatives, Robert's Rule Book is still in use as an authority on parliamentary matters. If ever there was an Irishman who not only kissed the Blarney Stone, but swept it off its supporting masonry, then that man was Oscar Wilde. Laughter is not at all a bad beginning for a friendship, and it is far the best ending for one. Wilde was the darling of late Victorian London's café society. His plays, poetries and books are still renowned today for their wit and insights into our human vagaries. Sadly, his own downfall was as spectacular as his glittering theatrical triumphs. In contrast, our next outrageous Irishman, although outspoken and derided for his controversial political views, led a charmed life as a playwright and writer. George Bernard Shaw. You cannot be a hero without being a coward. Despite belonging to the Fabian Society and embracing Marxism and eugenics, Shaw's career as a satirical dramatist and novelist leapt from strength to strength after going through some wilderness years when he first came to London in 1876. He received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1925 for his play St. Joan, later a film starring Ingrid Bergman as Joan of Arc. Some authors are way ahead of their time. Long before Walt Disney was born, there was an indie author who embraced the fantasy franchise. His name was L. Frank Baum. Hearts will never be practical until they can be made unbreakable. Another early starter, a teenage Baum, came easily to publishing when his father bought him and his brother a cheap printing press. An inveterate daydreamer, Frank soon began writing about the wonderful world of Oz. 13 sequels later, and with a seemingly insatiable young audience, Frank turned his hand to theatrical musicals, went into the silent film industry, and even briefly planned to build an amusement park, bringing his fantasy world into new markets. Next we have the very first Nobel laureate who wrote in the English language. At that time, aged 42, he was also the youngest ever recipient of the Prize for Literature. Rudyard Kipling. Words are, of course, the most powerful drug used by mankind. Despite a decline in popularity due to arguable political incorrectness, it is really not putting it too highly to regard Kipling as the Shakespeare of children's literature. The Jungle Books and Just So stories are still classic favourites today. Though approached several times, he refused both a knighthood and the post of Poet Laureate, which some take as his tacit disapproval of imperialism. There was much more to Miss Potter than nattily dressed bunnies and naughty squirrels. Despite her sheltered upbringing, she was fiercely independent and highly regarded for her knowledge and artistic studies of fungi. Beatrix Potter. Thank goodness I was never sent to school. It would have rubbed off some of the originality. Beatrix was passionate about the Cumbrian Lake District, where she farmed and bred sheep on the proceeds of her beautifully illustrated children's books. Her desire to preserve the hill farms of the area was instrumental in getting the Lake District National Park status. In the fields of sociology, history, and civil rights activism, William Du Bois was a prolific and influential author in the African-American fight for equal rights. W.E.B. Du Bois. A true and worthy ideal frees and uplifts a people. A false ideal imprisons and lowers. Du Bois was the co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People in 1909 and, as the editor of their journal, The Crisis, published many important works. His collection of essays, The Souls of Black Folk, is highly regarded as a seminal work in African American literature. Here is the man who could say that he wrote the book on writing, literally. William Strunk, Jr. Omit needless words. The Elements of Style was privately published by Strunk in 1919 for use in-house at Cornell University, where he was the professor of English. Strunk's former student, E.B. White, later revised and enlarged the work that White hailed as a 43-page summation of the case for cleanliness, accuracy and brevity in the use of English to 52 pages. The work became known as the Strunk and White Writing Style Manual. Acclaimed as one of the most influential authors of the 20th century, our next self-publisher also started out in his early teens, even though his education was badly disrupted by poor health. Marcel Proust. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. His major work, the highly acclaimed In Search of Lost Time, began in 1909, consisted of 7 volumes and the final ones had to be published posthumously. Keeping his homosexuality private, he fought a duel with a rival writer who'd spread malicious gossip about him. Though his life was tragically short, Crane began writing aged 4 and made his mark at age 24 with the Civil War classic, The Red Badge of Courage. Stephen Crane. A man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." "However," replied the universe, "the fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." In his last years, Crane mostly earned his living as a war correspondent for the New York Journal. He died of tuberculosis at a sanatorium in Germany. Originally a dentist, the best-selling author of Riders of the Purple Sage became the king of the classic Western genre. 112 movies were adapted from his books. Zane Grey. I must go deeper and even stronger into my treasure mine and stint nothing of time, toil or torture. Grey suffered from chronic depression, and this was not helped by a turbulent marriage made worse by his unrepentant womanizing. Wife Dolly saw Zane's infidelity as a handicap rather than a fatal flaw and lived with the situation, becoming his constant manager and editor. Zane's long and frequent fishing trips away from their ranch may also have sweetened the pill for Dolly. Our next author, poet, playwright and art collector lived for avant-garde art with a capital A. Born into wealth and living most of her life in Paris, she was hostess to the likes of Picasso, Hemingway, Matisse, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sinclair Lewis and fellow indie writer Ezra Pound. Gertrude Stein. One of the pleasant things those of us who write or paint do is to have the daily miracle. It does come. One of the first openly gay feminists, Stein was as controversial as she was brilliant. She regarded genius as a masculine, often leaving her life partner, Alice Toklas, with Hemingway's wife to chat, while Ernest and she talked of weightier matters. The author of Tarzan of the Apes came late to self-publishing in 1923, after he'd made his name writing popular pulp fiction in various genres for comic book serialization. In a long career, he published over 70 novels. Edgar Rice Burroughs. I write to escape poverty. What a writer he was. Kipling, in a posthumous memoir, said of him, "My Jungle Books begat zoos of them, but the genius of all the genii was one who wrote a series called Tarzan of the Apes." Ray Bradbury hailed him, in all seriousness, as probably the most influential writer in the entire history of the world. Here's a lady whose major opus, The Joy of Cooking, has been a family affair for decades and sold millions of copies around the world, but was self-published in 1931 and distributed by the author and her daughter in and around St. Louis. Irma von Starkloff-Rumbauer. A pig resembles a saint in that he is more honoured after death than during his lifetime. Few authors can claim to have been so influential. Irma is always right up there in contention to be the first ever superstar cookbook writer. Lyndon B. Johnson said of our next writer that he was more than the voice of America, more than the poet of its strength and genius. He was America. Carl Sandburg. Nearly all the best things that came to me in life have been unexpected, unplanned by me. A 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner, Sandburg was of Swedish ancestry. The reason that Johnson said that he was America is that he had such a wide experience of ordinary life, variously as a milk wagon driver, hotel servant, bricklayer, farm labourer, and a coal heaver. Perhaps his most memorable work was The American Song Bag, as he was also a great folk singer. In many respects, we owe a debt of gratitude to our next writer for his work in exposing the dangers of the gutter press in his books, The Jungle and The Brass Check. Upton Sinclair. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. Being attracted to the politics of the left and to investigative reporting for his novels, Sinclair was not popular with establishment newspapers. Time magazine described him as a man with every gift except humour and silence. Next we turn to another Irish writer who, on his visit to the Blarney Stone, might have told it that it should get itself a better vocabulary. Modesty and moderation were never foremost in mind for James Joyce. A man of genius makes no mistakes. His errors are volitional and are the portals of discovery. Avant-garde and outspoken, Joyce, famous for his use of stream of consciousness in novels such as Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, revelled in controversy. Highly intelligent, yet mentally troubled, this member of the artistically influential Bloomsbury Group started up the Hogarth Press in 1917 with her husband Leonard. Virginia Woolf. Language is wine upon the lips. With parents who mingled with the great artists and writers of the late Victorian era, Virginia and her sister Vanessa Bell were important figures in British modernism and early feminism. Despite an infamous sexual dalliance with Rita Sackville West and a string of breakdowns, her writing never suffered, and her novels, To the Lighthouse, Mrs. Dalloway, Orlando, and A Room of One's Own, are still popular today. The author of Lady Chatterley's Lover, now universally acclaimed as a classic, was driven into exile in 1919 because he was seen as a pornographer and German sympathiser. His wife Frieda was distantly related to the Red Baron Manfred von Richthofen. D. H. Lawrence. Life is a travelling to the edge of knowledge, then a leap taken. The key to understanding Lawrence's life and work is that he hated modern industry and mechanisation and valued instinct, spontaneity and emotional health. Contrarily, he was also drawn to the politics of the extreme right. Although speculation about his own sexuality is often debated, he remained devoted to Frieda until the end of his life. Living much of his life outside the USA, poet and critic Ezra Pound was a controversial figure. In 1945, he was arrested in Italy on charges of treason by US liberating forces. Ezra Pound. Humanity is the rich effluvium. It is the waste and the manure and the soil, and from it grows the tree of the arts. Described by Times magazine as a cat that walks by himself, tenaciously unhousebroken and very unsafe for children. Hemingway disagreed. The best of Pound's writing, and it is in the cantos, will last as long as there is any literature. Born in the United States, but becoming a British citizen in 1927, our next poet, playwright, and literary and social critic was a good friend of Ezra Pound, who called him Old Possum. T. S. Eliot. Only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. There was much more to Eliot than his practical cats that his widow, Valerie, brought to the attention of a well-known musical composer. Innovative and insightful, he said that his birthplace, St. Louis, and London shaped his poetry. The poet, painter and playwright, who played fast and loose with upper and lower cases, provided endless inspiration for composers, from Leonard Bernstein to Aaron Copland and Icelandic songwriter Björk. E. Cummins. The most wasted of all days is one without laughter. A Republican and admirer of McCarthy, who led a bohemian lifestyle, had short-lived marriages and a long common law relationship. Cummins mostly signed his name conventionally, using capitals. It's hard to say whether he occasionally used the lowercase version out of humility or with a sense of irony. This lady began keeping a journal at the age of 11 and kept at it to the end. Saying her life was interesting and eventful is an outrageous understatement. Anais Nin. The personal life, deeply lived, always expands into truths beyond itself. To see Ms. Nin simply as the lover of Henry Miller and, some say, his second wife June, is to ignore a fairly comprehensive list of male literary lions who shared her bed. However, she wrote as well as she loved, in a time when it was almost unthinkable that a woman would even want to write erotica. Next, we have an author who almost defies definition, having been described as a visionary, charlatan, nuclear physicist, tax dodger, saint, lunatic, and much more. L. Ron Hubbard. Never regret yesterday. Life is in you today, and you make your tomorrow. Whatever your opinion of the creator of Dianetics and the founder of the Church of Scientology, nobody can deny that he wrote a mean pulp fiction sci-fi story, or even a romance, and had a way with words. The multi-million best-selling What Colour Is Your Parachute was self-published in 1970 and has been getting revised every year since, from 1972, with 10-speed press. Richard N. Bollers. High tech needs to be complemented by high touch. A former Episcopal clergyman, Boller's family have always been strong on investigative reporting. Richard's son Mark has now joined the Parachute team as well as a major contributor for job hunting on the internet. Her best known work is Warning, but we know it better as the When I Am an Old Woman, I Shall Wear Purple poem by British poet Jenny Joseph. The craziest, most selfish act is to commit suicide. When you kill yourself, you kill others. Penned in 1961, Jenny's anthem for the children of the age of austerity after World War II has become the creed for the sensible to grow old disgracefully. Feminist, novelist, animal rights campaigner, poet, and chamber opera librettist, our next self-publisher is a true modern Renaissance woman, Margaret Atwood. If I waited for perfection, I would never write a word. 5 times nominee for the Booker Prize, Canadian Atwood finally won it in 2000 with The Blind Assassin. Other influential works are The Handmaid's Tale and The Edible Woman, reflecting her views on gender and social politics. Next, we have an author whose The Bridges of Madison County became an instant bestseller and was made into a major motion picture directed by and starring Clint Eastwood. Robert James Waller. Life is never easy for those who dream. Starting out teaching management and economics, Waller is also a photographer and musician. In 1993, he also recorded the Ballads of Madison County Songbook to accompany his more famous book. The author of Life's Little Instruction Book was originally written as a going-away gift for his son Adam when he went off to college. H. Jackson Brown, Jr. People take different roads seeking fulfillment and happiness. Just because they're not on your road doesn't mean they've gotten lost. Truly a traditional family man, Jackson Brown also published P.S. I Love You, mostly based on sayings and commentary from his own parents. Our next indie author co-wrote the highly successful In Search of Excellence with Robert H. Waterman Jr. Tom Peters. Communication is everyone's panacea for everything. Originally studying to become a civil engineer, Peters' career route changed after coming back from 2 tours in Vietnam, when he worked in the Pentagon and the White House. From there, he went back to college for qualifications in business management and then on to writing about it with 13 more titles under his belt. The authors of Chicken Soup for the Soul blasted the world of book marketing apart in 1993 with indie self-help publishers HCI. Jack Canfield. Crush your fears like stone turns into dust. Then water that dust and make cement. With that cement, build an empire. The Chicken Soup series went on to become a phenomenon, creating a whole company devoted to publishing consumer and media products. Mark Henson. You get whatever you expect to get. The only question is, what do you want? Our next author sold his first book, The Hunt for Red October, outright to Publishers Naval Institute Press for $5,000. Tom Clancy. There are 2 kinds of people, the ones who need to be told and the ones who figure it out all by themselves. Realising the book's potential, NIP soon renegotiated Clancy's contract with them and, with praise coming from President Reagan, the rest is history. For a child whose father abandoned his family using the oldest line in the book, I'm going out to buy a pack of cigarettes, our next author went on to great things. Stephen King. Talent is cheaper than table salt. What separates the talented individual from the successful one is a lot of hard work. With 54 novels and counting, including those written under his pen name Richard Bachman, King is the poster boy for indie authors and publishers, starting with I Was a Teenage Grave Robber. A prominent figure in the New Age movement, our next author has made his name in the field of alternative medicine through his books and videos. Deepak Chopra. If you want to do really important things in life and big things in life, you can't do anything by yourself, and your best teams are your friends and your siblings. After 5 years as Chief of Staff at the New England Memorial Hospital, Chopra resigned from traditional medicine in 1985 when he embraced transcendental meditation as a healthy lifestyle choice. Our next indie broke ground for authors when his best-selling book, The Celestine Prophecy, hit the shelves in 1992. James Redfield. The world is much more mysterious than we ever thought. A lifelong fascination with Eastern and Western philosophies and studying Taoism and Zen at college, Redfield's career began in interactive psychology, working with abused teens. Sharing a record with J.K. Rowling and Tom Clancy for selling over 2 million books from a first print, this author began his working life as a criminal lawyer in Mississippi. John Grisham. Writing's still the most difficult job I've ever had, but it's worth it. Grisham left his lucrative job as a lawyer and politician in the Mississippi House of Representatives in 1990 to write full-time. His first book, A Time to Kill, was taken up on a 5,000 book deal by a small unheard-of publisher, Wynwood Press, in 1989. The movie of the book became a smash hit worldwide box office success in 1996. The Christmas Box was written as a present for the author's children. After failing to attract a publisher, the book was self-published and sold through local bookshops. Richard Paul Evans. I believe that love is the choice we make to raise ourselves and others to the highest planes of existence. The year after The Christmas Box came out, in 1994, as it became the #2 bestseller on the New York Times listings, Evans signed with a major publisher. A genuine Christmas miracle. Whatever opinion you hold about her book's literary merits, most authors would think they were on cloud 9 if they had sales figures to match hers. E.L. James. Write for yourself, that's it, and write every day. Okay, so 50 Shades of Grey and its sequels may have actually turned some critics, fellow authors, and even some readers 50 Shades of Puce, or perhaps a nasty green colour. But James's vampire fanfic venture that created a whole new market for mummy porn has to be the stuff of legends, surely. Nobody can knock the UK's fastest selling paperback series of all time now, can they? That's all we have so far, folks. Perhaps you'll be our next featured author. You just never know. Thank you for watching our short stroll through the history of self-publishing. Please do feel free to leave your comments and queries about any aspect of the video on the conference website, or go to janhawke.me on my contacts listing. Farewell and keep on writing.